Good evening, all of you. I'm Kanishk Shekhar, and we have with us Mr. Sanjay Upadhyay, who will discuss with us about his latest book, Backfire in Nepal: How India Lost the Plot to China. Sanjay ji, welcome to the show.
Thank you
Welcome to
very
our
much.
talk session, sir.
Yep, so it's a great pleasure to be here.
Thanks. Before we proceed with the intricacies of your scholarly researched book, I would like to ask you so that our readers and our viewers are able to know about you. So, what prompted you to be an author, and when did this journey actually start?
Well, now that I look at it, it started from childhood because I was born in Nepal, where my father was in the diplomatic service, but I was born into a very politically active extended family, spanning the ideological spectrum in Nepal. And at another level, we had this connection with India, family connection with India. Actually, my father took part in the Indian independence movement. Uh,
Okay,
he the idea with Nepali youths at time was that if India became independent, it would help Nepal become a democracy because Nepal was under a Rana oligarchy, not the king, but the hereditary
mm-hmm.
prime system. So my
Okay,
father and people like him, BP Koirala, Manmohan Adhikari, all these luminaries, who my father was just a basic student at that time, but they were of the opinion that if India became independent, it would help a Nepali democracy. So they would
okay,
be in touch with Gandhiji, Pandit Nehru, of course, and across the Indian political spectrum. And having grown there, this whole thing would be part of the family conversation, basically. So I look back at it now that it kind of kindled my interest very early on. And India, I lived for a time uh, on a city on the southern part of Nepal, Biratnagar, on eastern
okay,
Nepal border. And it's an interesting thing because I used to go to India every day to read my Indian newspaper. At the
okay,
stall, I'd walk over the border, read the Times of India in this Jogbani stall, walk back to Nepal. So it was, very, very culturally, uh, at the people's level, a very close link. And I would see this interaction, despite that closeness. Nepal had relationships with other countries at the time when I was growing up, United States, China. So all these things, they would be part of the daily conversation. And later on, when I became a journalist, there were questions, and I had the privilege of being, a front row witness to a lot of the things that happened. So
okay,
very later on, maybe 2008, I did my first book on the complexity of the India-Nepal relationship, and
mm-hmm.
from that time on, I've been trying to study the dynamics of how these different interactions come into play into Nepal.
Okay. So then, what took you to US from Nepal? I mean, how did that journey started?
Well, I was in and out. I lived in the United States for a few years in my early childhood when my father was posted there. I lived in Thailand. I lived in New Delhi for 2 years. Um, Around the early 90s to do my master's in journalism. And I
Okay.
went back to Nepal, and then my wife came here to study, and then we've been here ever since. I mean,
So you are a journalist by education and training,
yes, a journalist by education.
essentially a journalist.
Yes.
Okay. Okay. So nice of you to let all our viewers and readers know about the journey that you have had. Now, discussing about your book, and
Yes.
this is your third book on Nepal. So, India and Nepal, it is often believed, are culturally connected. They share some civilizational ethos. It starts from Ayodhya, it goes till Janakpur, from Kashi Vishwanath to Pashupatinath, from Bodh Gaya to Lumbini. So, closeness actually makes people very fond of each other. Why
Yes.
this not so pleasant situation between the two countries?
No, that's a very that's a puzzle. I mean, that's always struck me. Uh, you know, the we kind of are locked in what in another book I've called an embrace of estrangement. I mean, part of it may have to do with the very difference in our size, power, or uh, India being India, Nepal being a small country between India and China. Part of it is probably from my perspective, from the Nepali perspective, from my own my observations in Nepal over different political systems, the monarchy, democracy, Maoists, everything. There is this kind of feeling that people directly, they don't express it, but underlying everything is that we have a feeling that India may not be fully reconciled to the idea of Nepal's independence. It might sound very crude to put it that way, but let me say this, Nepal, Bhutan, and Sikkim were three Himalayan states that the British left after departing from the subcontinent. And Sikkim, India became part of the Indian Union. Bhutan is in a very strong relationship where India and Bhutan, India takes care of India's defense, a very close consultation on defense foreign policy. And Nepal was locked in a 1950 treaty. Now, over the years, Nepal being the bigger of the three Himalayan states, we had a very vibrant democracy in the 1950s after Indian independence, and a very active and growing communist movement also, where this whole nationalism strand just grew. And because this perception of
Sir, you have been muted, sir. You need to unmute yourself.
oh, sorry.
Yeah.
Because of
Sorry.
this sense of insecurity that we always had, especially after Sikkim, Nepal went on to promote its international profile in a way that, we had the Soviets there, we had the Americans there, the Europeans there. And a lot of times, given the Cold War dynamics when India was allied with the Soviet Union, a very leading figure of the non-aligned movement,
Okay.
there were these differences that Nepal thought that it was an independent country exercising its sovereign options, whereas India, kind of saw Nepal veering away from the 1950 commitments. And I think that's the very basic perception of is Nepal independent? And if it is, how much of that independence is India willing to cede?
Give an assert.
Yeah, but the thing is, Nepali leaders don't come out openly and say these things, and the Indian side too also never, kind of officially has never come out and said anything about anything other than upholding Nepal's independence, sovereignty, and everything. But there are times, when like Mr. Pranab Mukherjee's autobiography came out the other day. And interestingly, he mentioned that, Nepal's king wanted to merge India with India, but Nehru kind of made a mistake, didn't do it, and Indira Gandhi.
Yes.
Now, this is something that is a refrain on the part of people who are not in power, basically. Mr. Mukherjee, a very great, good friend of Nepal, he is no more with us. So these things, from time to time, they tend to come up saying, oh, Patelji had a, said this, and now we're paying the price of that. And that's when these things get revived, these sentiments in Nepal. So I think, on both sides, it's just where perceptions tend to overtake reality at times, and where the reality of this strong relationship at the ground level, at the people-to-people level, culturally, everything. But these perceptions sometimes take over, especially during political crises in Nepal. Anti-Indianism is a very potent vote getter in Nepal, I would like to say. Any party. So these things happen, and but it's unfortunate. Basically, it's so unfortunate that I don't know how our two countries, being so close and being able to do so much together. India has helped us, from the very beginning. Even, India itself was not a very resourceful country in the after independence, during Pandit Nehru's time. But every sector, health, our first university, our first airport, our first highway, Indian workers have died constructing, highways on these difficult terrain. Remittances, we talk about the Gulf nowadays, but lots of these Nepali workers who worked in India, and then they sustained the Nepali economy, and the open border, like I mentioned before. So it's so unfortunate that we have not been able to reconcile this, the depth of our relationship with these external factors that come into play a lot of these times.
Right. Mr. Sanjay, your book actually starts with this interesting tale of the complexity of relation between the two countries. This is where the initial chapters of the book deal with. Interestingly, on 6th of December 1950, Nehru, while addressing Indian Parliament, he said this on record, that Nepal cannot have intimate relations with other countries as it has with India. So there is this palpable big brotherly attitude. Do you think it has created an kind of irreversible feeling of bitterness amongst the masses, Nepali masses?
No, I mean, we have to go back to history. At the time, it was a very, very dangerous situation for India, for Nepal, both. The Chinese had just come to Tibet, and we didn't know, what their behavior, what their next move would be. But then again, Pandit Nehru was at that time, having a good relationship. His vision of Hindi Chini Bhai Bhai. It was in that position that these whole things, everything happened. So maybe again, the perception thing. Maybe India, among the different options of dealing with Nepal, had its basic perception of the 1950 treaty as more security oriented. The open border between India and Nepal, naturally India's legitimate grievances at that time, and over time, as Nepal for its part, right after that became a democracy, and then the king took over a royal regime. And our perception of the 1915 treaty was that it was a form of an acknowledgement of Indian recognition of Nepal's sovereignty in exchange for those security guarantees. So naturally, other countries will come in to Nepal, and those activities, in India's view, was they were not entirely friendly towards India at times. The U.S., the Chinese, of course, diplomatic relations with China, because over time, the whole Hindi Chini Bhai Bhai got that set back all the way, leading to the 62 war. So over time, the premise, the divergence in our views on the premise of the 1950 treaty, I think that's we have to address. Now, to be fair to Pandit Nehru, when he made that statement, we had just signed a treaty in which India's expectation was that Nepal was going to be fully sensitive to India's security concerns. And let me tell you, as a matter of fact, together with the 1950 treaty, there were 2 letters that were exchanged, but were private. They were not made public.
Right.
Obviously, Pandit Nehru was privy to those letters, whereas they were not made public, where Nepal had made guarantees for India's security concerns, apparently.
Security, yes.
So he was speaking on that premise. So he was not being incorrect. But again, as I say, perceptions matter. At the time, we had the Americans, we had the Chinese, the Russians coming in, the Soviet, and this whole notion of how Nepal would build its international identity. You know, we had a king who was very assertive that way, and Nepal was going from India's 1950 treaty, from the originalists' perspective, the Nehruvian perspective, Nepal was seen veering off course, whereas we thought we were just exercising our sovereign and independent actions.
Actually, very correctly put, sir. As a matter of fact, the 1950 treaty that you mentioned about, many analysts from Nepal's side often point out that this treaty was signed between the 2 countries. It was a bilateral treaty. But then the signatories, if I mention the names, the nomenclatures, it was signed by the Prime Minister of Nepal and Indian ambassador to Nepal.
Yes.
So you can see the hint there that, yes, the equal footing was missing. And I think over a period of time, would it be right to say that this has costed India in due course of time?
Yes. Let me just say this. We had a Rana prime minister, the last of the Rana oligarchy, the very powerful prime minister, but his regime was collapsing.
Okay.
Regime was collapsing. And his vision of the 1950 treaty was to prevent the Chinese from making any moves into Nepal, and asserting Nepal's independence, so that even after the British left, Pandit Nehru would continue recognizing his government. So it was, a very tricky situation from the Nepalese side. So the prime minister signed the treaty with the Indian ambassador, but a few months later, his regime collapsed. So we had democratic leaders come in, who by which India again brokered this whole compromise between the king and the Ranas and the Nepali Congress. So once that regime collapsed, and that inequality between the signatories has rankled Nepal ever since. Now, was it meant entirely to show Nepal's inferior status to India? I don't think so. Maybe, communication, transportation,
it was
being
done
what
in
it was.
the heat of the moment, the situation that were prevalent at that time.
So the ambassador was in Nepal, the prime minister was in Nepal, they signed it. So once that was done, then everybody moved to Delhi to...
Probably the objective was to get it done rather than how it is being done.
Yes, exactly. So, but then subsequent events, what happened was, and every time this has happened, I mean, in 1950, what happened? The same thing happened in 2005 when India brokered this democracy between the Maoists and the mainstream opposition parties.
Yes.
Done in New Delhi, and at that time, it was done, I would say, from the point, maybe it was done, in good faith or better faith than what we see now, but it goes back to that unequal signatories there that, creates these perceptions, fuels them, saying that, maybe India had some other hidden motive here now that, that's why this hasn't worked. So maybe it's micromanaging Nepali politics in ways that that may not work, or that's only fueled more anti-Indianism among even traditional friends of India in Nepal, Nepali Congress, let's say, others. And these whole, like where I say the perception overtakes reality. I mean, we tend to forget all the benefits that this post 1950 relationships with India has brought us, and we focus on this, the irritants that are, which is unfortunate.
Certainly.
Yes.
Actually, there are multiple interpretations of that one-off event, and it is
Yes.
casting its aspersion.
Yes.
Again, sir, in your book, you have time and again mentioned that there are multiple stakeholders in India when
Yes.
it comes to framing India's stand towards Nepal.
Yes.
But given that foreign policy is actually a specialist domain, how can there be a mature stand and multiple stakeholders from India? I mean, there are certain families. It's often been observed that Nepali ambassadors to India are often Madhesis, and Indian ambassadors to Nepal are mainly from Bihar and eastern Uttar Pradesh. So, is there something like professionalism is lacking in the bilateral ties between the two countries?
No. I don't think that is necessarily a bad thing. It only speaks to this multiple and multiplicity of layers in our overall relationship that is also reflected in diplomacy. Ordinarily, the foreign ministries would be dealing with these issues between countries. But what happens is there is consistency among Indian political parties, say Congress, BJP, left governments on foreign policy defense. Nepal kind of presents a very unique case where personal relationships and broader societal relationships, have their impact on the broader official diplomatic relationship between the country. Let me give you an example. Institutionally, from Nepal's perspective, I can go back to 2005 2006 as a very instructive point, which I also mentioned in the book. We could see, anybody closely studying India's Nepal policy can see that there was a big gap between the External Affairs Ministry and the security agencies on the one hand, and the Indian Home Ministry, the Indian military on the other.
Okay.
This was during Prime Minister Manmohan's time, on how to deal with Nepal, Yes, whether to promote the Maoists in the way India was, whether that would be prudent, or whether, taming the king, taping the king would be more relevant and beneficial to India, as the security forces and the Home Ministry would argue. And that struggle went on for a while because, although the 2005 blueprint was signed in November, it didn't come into operation until April, and even then it was a very, very ambiguous thing. It was a compromise of those varied Indian interests that were watching and waiting. A lot of royal, formerly princely families in the Congress Party that were pro, a resurgent Hindu constituency in India that wanted Nepal to, if not a monarchy, then at least a Hindu republic. And people who said that, this is the best time to mainstream the Maoists, Nepali Maoists, for fear of, they might just have some working relationship with the Indian Naxals that could then present a far greater threat. So it was more like a watch and wait situation. I tend to think that there was no finality, when India kind of got into that 12-point agreement. And once it was implemented, there were too many external variables that India could not control that went on in Nepal, all the way from the UN from China, from America, from non-governmental organizations, from issue-based groups that India just could not foresee at that time. So it was not it was bold, as I say in the book. It was a bold bet, but it was certainly not. The conviction was certainly not wholehearted there.
Interestingly, Mr. Sanjay, in your book, you say that when this transition was happening, at some point of time, the government of India became slightly not they were not on very good terms with the Nepali monarch, and they were favoring the communist or the Maoist in Nepal.
Yes.
So, isn't this puzzling that a functioning democracy chooses to side with communist or Maoist at the cost of monarchy? Did India made a blunder?
I mean, with the maturity of Indian diplomacy over time, and the level-headedness, the reasonableness it has shown internationally, I would certainly hesitate to say it was done out of any sense of
Okay,
clumsiness. But I
but that
think
certainly was not the best thing to do at that time.
no, it was that's the debate that went on. What I say in the book is while the logic of Indian Nepali Maoists joining the political mainstream to end the insurgency that was spiraling out of control may have a certain logic to it. But what
Okay,
I found a little mystifying was that India not only weakened the monarchy, it did nothing to promote, forces traditionally friendly to India, like the Nepali Congress. So when
actually,
that became apparent, India backed the Madhesi front with their genuine grievances. I mean, let's not underestimate the Madhesi grievances, but India backed them in a way that proved counterproductive to the whole idea of who would actually turn out to be a correct bet, because the monarchy, for all its failings vis-a-vis India's expectations, it was a traditional force. It had goodwill, and in my opinion, in my observation, also, it was bound by its limits. As a Hindu supreme Hindu institution, to go
right.
against any core Indian interests. But at that time, the idea was that the Nepalese monarchy was always unfriendly to India, going with China. And I think a little more appreciation for why the monarchy, successive kings had to accommodate, Chinese pressures, out of choice, out of compulsion, out of balancing, that might have helped. But I think, the way this whole thing has persisted after the Maoist rise to power, after the democratic republic's establishment, may have, prompted a look back, in India, that maybe, anti-Indianism was not, the monopoly of the monarchy, and there may have been some merit in seeking to stick to the original blueprint. The 12-point Accord actually never mentioned the abolition of the monarchy. It says an end to the autocratic monarchy, which was the dictatorial powers that the king had taken, but it never mentioned removing the monarchy in that thing. So how that happened in Nepal over time, one step after the other, almost like a chess game, that eventually the monarchy was abolished. It's just amazing to any student of Nepali history or Nepali affairs at that time.
Correct. And yes, yeah, it's nowadays it is said in Nepal that India promises but China delivers. To what extent is this true?
I don't think that's true at all. The reason being, India promises, yes, but we have to see the extensiveness and the breadth of India's development partnership with Nepal, commitment to Nepal. And the Chinese, of course, there was a limit to their involvement over the years, high infrastructure projects, this, that, and it was not easy. And now all these projects that we hear about, the BRI, Chinese ports, Chinese access to Chinese things, Chinese infrastructure, Chinese train coming to Nepal, but you have to look beyond the headlines. These things are, even if they materialize, they're over the long term. You may have Chinese trains transporting goods from China to Nepal, but at what cost? When Calcutta is right there, when Visakhapatnam is right there,
Yes.
will Nepal be able to afford those things at prices, at Chinese transported prices? So there is a long-term vision, a framework for China now, but in terms of everyday insistence and everyday things, I think it's unfair to say that India has not delivered. India only promises. No, there are times when a lot of things, like we have the Mahakali Pancheshwar project, where a detailed project report was supposed to have been made in 6 months. That hasn't happened in, say, 20, 25 years. Prime Minister KP Oli, he used to be a minister at that time, and he was the one pushing for the treaty. And it's just, Uttar Pradesh became bifurcated into, Uttaranchal, Uttarakhand, and now they have their own upper, lower
Houses.
things, internal projects. But so these things, they do get delayed. A lot of projects like those do get delayed. But I think, India has done quite a lot that goes unappreciated in Nepal. I have to say that, because over the years, studying different parts of Nepal, being there, trained manpower, scholarships, education. And again, I always emphasize this was during a time when India itself was in great need. It was not the India of today, very limited resources. So, that we can never overlook in this whole India-Nepal relationship,
So that can never be really overlooked.
No,
There is
never.
an Indian imprint. Mr. Sajay, moving to the next question, there is a very interesting analogy that emerges that the kind of insecurity Pakistan faces in Afghanistan by the presence of India is something similar what India faces in Nepal with respect to China. Now, would that be a correct assertion to make?
Yes and no. Yes, in the sense. Yes, in the sense, of course, with the current situation, the whole evolving regional and international dynamics, we have all these narratives of Quad Plus, India, US alliance, containment, encirclement, whatever. In that sense, yes. But in another sense, from my understanding of, the issue, China's problem with India and Nepal is not, India per se. It's just that, how other countries, powers, interests would piggyback on India and then threaten its what China considers its legitimate interests. Because let me say this, irrespective of what happens with Nepal-China relations, the basic foundational relationship with India will never change. I mean, to put it simply, China can never replace India and Nepal, and Nepal should never have to be in a position to make that choice. It would be very, very unfortunate, because we need both countries. Now, India has its legitimate grievances with Nepal, and China, I would say, has had limited um, interests and influences, which is now growing, primarily due to the Tibet factor, which is now again, boiling up now with the impending succession struggle, which I would say, which is not reported over the Dalai Lama. The recent American law that was passed almost challenges China from a tradition of what Beijing considers its tradition of confirming the new Dalai Lama. And the Dalai Lama himself has said, he may have to rethink some of the traditions that govern the Dalai Lama succession issue. And this thing is a very, very sore point for China in Nepal because of the large Tibetan population, the open border with India, and now this eagerness among certain constituencies in India that want to use the so-called Tibet card against, China. And that's why China is in a very belligerent mood in Nepal, because I think it does not trust the Nepali state's ability to ensure its interests. That's why you see the Chinese ambassadors, Chinese delegations coming in, Chinese very aggressive diplomacy going on, which traditionally Indian ambassadors used to do. So it's almost like they're taking a leaf from the Indian playbook.
Indian book.
And this succession issue, and let me say this also, it's not one night like, one monarch and then the crown prince becomes king, he consolidates. No, because the Dalai Lama, first of all, he has to be born. And the little guy who's born, he will have to be of a certain age where he can identify the Dalai Lama's glasses, his relics. And then from among those kids, there's a certain process where that person will be anointed and then confirmed, and then he will have to attain majority. So look at how long and drawn out this almost, let's say, 15.
A very gradual and slow simmering process it would be.
And
it's not going to happen very soon.
No. And then the Chinese are worried that, this long thing is, it can be anything, Tibetan independence, Tibetan Xinjiang, and Tibet, in the Chinese word for Tibet is Xizang, and that is like the treasure house. It's basically the treasure house of China. All the minerals and natural resources, everything is there, water, and you can understand how they are. And Nepal is the country with the longest border with Tibet, longer than India's border with Tibet or any other. And that is Nepal being a weak state, weak politically. Now, if only India was involved, I think China, for a time, President Xi, President Modi, Prime Minister Modi, during their informal summits, they wanted to agree on this framework where, a trilateral kind of framework where Nepal, India, and China could, agree on things, at least in a way that, Nepal doesn't become a sore point in their overall bilateral situation. Now, that didn't happen. So that happened, especially after COVID, things took a very drastically different turn. And I think, this is the cause for the Chinese reaction now. It's like some pressure, not only to India, but also to Nepal now to say that, you better get your act together, where your thing. And then one thing we must not forget is how, we know how India views Nepal, but there is not much appreciation of how China from time immemorial has viewed Nepal.
Okay.
I will tell you a historical fact. Nepal was the last tributary country, that sent a delegation to the Chinese Empire until the
Qing dynasty, right?
Yes. And then there was a time when the Dalai Lama used to pay tribute to Nepal, and Nepal used to pay tribute to China. So this thing, they remember, they remember things from 5,000 years ago. And whether it's the Chinese Empire, whether it was Republican China, the interregnum, Chiang Kai-shek, he considered Nepal a part of China's sphere. And Mao Zedong, of course, everybody knows the palm and the five fingers.
Palm and the five fingers, where Nepal becomes one of the very important component.
So they have never renounced it. I mean, they might not say it, they may be quiet about it, but that's how they view Nepal, because we were a tributary country to them by a treaty, regardless of how Nepalis feel about that. They hold that. And so it's more like an overlapping sphere of influence. They haven't challenged it in that way to India, because India speaks of its sphere of influence, but this is a competing sphere of influence from the Chinese point of view. Now, if they're not able to do anything about it, like the post-Tiananmen Square, or if China collapses, or if there's a weakening internal event that, China, maybe they'll just withdraw. But withdraw should not be seen as, a renunciation. They'll just come back one day and say, regardless of the kind of government there is.
It can very well bounce back.
Even a democratic government, like elected multi-party democratic government in China, cannot renounce the historical extent of the Chinese influence. So, I mean, this is something that is not appreciated at all, either in Nepal or in India, anywhere. Now, that's what I'm kind of a little bit of, hesitant to say that.
About, yes.
Yeah, it might get worse in the days ahead if.
Okay. Mr. Sanjay, when you say that Indian stakes cannot be completely diluted in Nepal, and there is an element of truth in it, but currently Prime Minister Oli, this happened last week, he was giving interview to few Indian channels.
Yes.
And there he said that China is an all-weather friend of Nepal. And between India and China, Prime Minister Oli calls for what he terms sovereign equality.
Yes.
So where do you see this going in future? I mean, currently the parliament has been dissolved. The elections are due. If at all PM Oli comes back, or if Mr. Prachanda comes back, what will be the ramifications for India?
Now, I think in a very tragic sense, India has been presented with the worst of everything, Like I said, it was the prime driver of the change that the culmination of the change was this dissolution of parliament. India pushed, these reforms, these advances, and to a point where it got a constitution in Nepal that it could not wholeheartedly agree with, because, it has serious reservations. And that exemplifies how much it has lost the initiative in Nepal. But now India has wisely just sat back. That's the least bad of the worst options it could have, where it is trying to see how things sort out themselves, because Prachanda criticizes India, Oli criticizes India. I mean, Oli says, I dissolved parliament because I wanted to, save democracy. Prachanda is saying India was complicit in the dissolution. So India, is in a very, very bad situation. And it has stepped back and said, okay, you're going to blame us anyway. So sort your things out first. Elections, okay. No elections, no. But one thing I think India has very, very... I think this has been a learning process for India also, that it cannot, see this strain of, Indian, well, if not entirely anti-Indianism, let's just say distrust, mistrust, episodic, perceptions of Nepali politicians. So it will have to handle, this whole thing. It can no longer blame the Maoists for being anti-Indian or the king for being anti-Indian, and go to this whole basic reason of this phenomenon. And again, it takes me back to the elephant in the room that I have been saying. This whole perception of India's reconcile India is to Nepal's independence. Now, is there a perception that somehow it was an aberration or an injustice of partition of that Nepal somehow managed to be out of the Indian Union because of its security ramifications that have been lingering on? If that is so, then an independent Nepal will never, will always be a security threat to India. Or whether, an independent Nepal can be independent but cannot maintain relationships with other countries, like the way Bhutan is very much guided, very consented, and I don't hear the Bhutanese complaining that much about Indian interference either. So and Sikkim, we talk about in Nepal, everybody says that India annexed Sikkim, and I'm still waiting to see a single demonstration against India in Sikkim. It's all the people outside talking about. So if the people of Sikkim are fine, these issues become to be seen in a different light. But the basic thing is this whole concept of the independence of Nepal vis-a-vis India's perception. Now, again, let me emphasize, there is nothing officially that India has done that would suggest that India does not treat Nepal as a sovereign, independent, equal partner. Nothing at all. I have to be very categorical about that. But again, things just come out. Like I mentioned, Pranab Mukherjee, this thing has going on for a while, that, King Tribhuvan is dead, King Mahendra is dead, his secretary, who I spoke to. I've spoken to the secretary who was there with the late secretary who was there at Hyderabad House with the two kings on what things were going on. So, a privileged conversation, but, it happened in a way that things overtook Pandit Nehru also, the Nepali side, that they had to get into a regime where this king was returned. So there is no document produced showing that. You can show an instrument of accession that neither India or Nepal signed, or even how Patel said that, or why Nehru didn't accept it or did accept it, or even notes about the discussion that went on. The Ministry of External Affairs probably has an extensive archive on this episode of Indian history. That's never come out. So why is this thing coming out again? Now, again, minor things come in, everybody says that. And when you talk about a cultural Akhanda Bharat, then, of course, that becomes Bangladesh, Pakistan. But again, that kind of rankles things here. And then sometimes, like during your election campaign, I think, this is a very, I'm taking this as a very lighthearted and a very illustrative example. No pettiness intended here. But I was remembering this whole idea about, Prime Minister Modi and Prime Minister, his challenger Rahul Gandhi, talking about Chokidar and Chokidar Chor hai, and then somebody from the third party comes out and said, if we want a Chokidar, Nepal. So we get the Chokidar from Nepal. So these are like things that do not. Nobody does this intentionally, but when these things slip out, they tend to bring out some part of the subtext.
So
of this.
there, Mr. Sanjay, it can be concluded from this your analysis that there are certain kind of offshoots, some probable areas of confrontation, some fault lines which at times are manipulated by Western interests on either side.
All sides, not only Western. Chinese will manipulate sometimes, because let me say this: India's security concerns, no matter what we consider them, from India's point of view, they are legitimate. Let there be no doubt about this. India's security concerns, whether it be Chinese things today, ISI involvement in the 90s, Indian wanted criminals, terrorists finding refuge in Nepal.
Nepal, yes.
From
It became a safe haven actually in
Yes,
90s.
so these things are, they are legitimate, as is, the legitimacy of Chinese uh, concerns regarding the Tibet issue from Nepal for them, because as this whole dichotomy of the Nepali psyche vis-a-vis China, Kanishk, I think you have to see from just one thing. A free Tibet. I've interacted with Tibetans all over the world. Who doesn't want Tibetans to have democracy, right? I mean,
Actually,
they're oppressed. They want their own country. The Dalai Lama, I've met him a couple of times. I mean, not personally, but I've seen him, I've heard him, I've shaken hands with him. He's a very charming person, and what's there not to like about him? But
correct.
ask an average Nepali today, what will be the price Nepal will have to pay for an independent Tibet? It will lose the border with China. Now,
Actually,
so Nepal will be India locked from three sides. A weak Tibet, which will probably have a more Indian influence.
it does not gel well for Nepal if Tibet become.
No, politically, like I always like to say, politically, a free Tibet is amenable to, actually very attractive to Nepalis. But geopolitically, a free Tibet is like a death knell for Nepal. So you have to understand these undercurrents that create the perception of this whole triangle. And on top of that, when you have Western powers, and when we talk about the Indo-West, let's not be, it's Trump or Biden, because you have the EU, and even within the EU, you have the Scandinavians, and then you have the more traditional Germans, and then you have
Actually,
NGOs, INGOs, the fragmentation of, say, Nepali, the political map, how the Tarai should be divided among states, not impinging on India's concerns. We have Bengal there, we have UP there, we have Bihar. The principal
different stakeholders are there, and so much of permutation and combination involved that
and
it
then you have the same thing with the Chinese border. If that state goes all the way up there, which part of Tibet are we talking about there? And
actually
during this Dalai Lama's time, all these pressures have been subsumed. But if you look at Tibetan history, they have their own internal rifts over which yellow hat, blue hat, all these hats in Tibetan Buddhism. So that's going to come out, and then it's a very, very explosive situation. Something handed down by history, basically. So we cannot change it, right? I mean, how do we reconfigure the entire map? And if something happens in Nepal that will go on to influence the insecurity of both our neighbors,
actually
then of course we have to be mindful of those situations. And sometimes I wonder whether we are even capable of exercising that kind of judgment. With everything, everybody, and every institution being politicized that way. So I think India and
Sanjay ji,
China come up with some agreement.
we have a question coming up
Okay.
for you. Do you think putting SARC at the back burner by India also had some kind of an impact, as top leadership of both the countries meet less often than they used to earlier? Now, there is a reason why India has completely made SARC a redundant body. It's made basically because of Pakistan. And are the other members suffering, and is it affecting India-Nepal bilateral ties?
Let me just say this. The SARC, to begin with, in terms of bilateralism, was never a great vehicle for India-Nepal relationships. I mean, outside the collective self-reliance framework. That's why there was little politics always held up SARC. And from Nepal's perspective, I don't know how the other countries, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, Maldives, Bhutan feel, but this whole idea of isolating Pakistan, at one level, has stopped some progress, whatever limited progress there was in disaster reduction, free trade, visa-free kind of these areas that are less politically charged. But again, India has sought to bring on BIMSTEC, which is Nepal is also a member, and extended that whole region more eastward towards Burma, Bangladesh, and then that side. So this organization has stepped in to do some thing. But the problem of isolating Pakistan has the unintended, well, I wouldn't say unintended, I mean, it has the unfortunate, well, not even unfortunate, it has created a situation where China has created a subgroup within South Asia, especially over COVID. But basically now it's expanding, where the Chinese foreign minister has regular sub-regional consultations with Pakistan, Nepal, Afghanistan. So that, has kind of stepped in. So I don't know how much, isolating SARC from that has helped, India's long run. But we understand that, India-Pakistan relationships was always going to be a very, very challenge for SARC. And despite that, I think SARC has made some progress in terms of at least making each other aware of, each other, because we never had contact, like say Maldives or, for Nepal or even Sri Lanka at some point.
So if we view SARC holistically, yes, there are returns for all the stakeholders involved.
There are, and very explicitly, SARC has the charter by itself has excluded bilateral issues, because the founders always knew that bilateral issues would bog down the whole exercise of collective self-reliance. But it's not always possible to exclude bilateral relationships issues, contentious bilateral issues from the forum. So unless everybody has a way of ensuring that these issues are best left outside or through other channels, then I don't know, even if SARC is revived, I don't know how much it can do anything. I mean, it's going to be paralyzed by its own nature.
Contradictions.
Yes.
Mr. Sanjay, there is another question. After the general election in Nepal, do you think there will be a change in the kind of strained ties that both the countries have witnessed of late? And how both the political forces, be it the incumbent Communist Party and the Nepalese Congress Party, look at the current regime of Narendra Modi in India? Do they view Modi regime as slightly more aggressive in terms of its posturing, not only with regards to Nepal, but probably with regards to all the other states, with regards to China maybe?
Well, at the beginning, Prime Minister Modi came to Nepal. He addressed the Nepalese parliament, and he was able to win over
a lot of Bonoheim at that time when PM Modi went there,
yes,
especially after the floods and all.
Yeah, he was the first to categorically say that the 1950 treaty needs to be reviewed in light of the current realities. Much has changed since 1950. So that was one thing that was really, music to Nepalese ears, so to speak.
Okay. But
then we had this, non-governmental eminent personalities group. People from India and Nepal constituted a group that had ways of improving bilateral relations, the entire gamut of it, including the 1950 treaty. And it submitted it issued its report 2 years ago, 2018, I think, to the Nepalese Prime Minister. But Mr. Modi has not been able to schedule a date to even receive the report, so that kind of, creates some questions in Nepali minds, that what happened to the Modi of, 2014.
Previous, who came here? What happened to the earlier avatar?
Yeah, earlier after Modi. So, and on top of that, there is some concern that, maybe after the second term, they might be a greater influence of, the Hindu element in the Indian government, which again has this fear in Nepal, let's say.
To say this, some analysts, Mr. Sanjay, do believe that whether Modi government or some other government in India, RSS has a significant role to shape India's Nepal policy.
Yes,
Is
and
there?
and the fear is, when you speak of the RSS in terms of the current Nepali political dynamics today, is
Right.
that they fear that there might be, say, ultimately a restoration of the Hindu monarchy, or at least Hindu state, which again, these elements that are in power now, officially at least, they
Okay.
cannot countenance, basically. So if the elections happen, then we'll have to see how who gains. If the Nepali Congress does, in Nepali Congress government might be able to inject a greater moderation in bilateral relations. We have the border issue of Kalapani, the map and
Yes.
everything, which is very contentious, and there was a national consensus on that. There was only one person who voted. Voted against that resolution, and then even she was expelled because for doing that. Everybody voted for it, but and that thing is in our constitution, so that's going to remain a very big element as long as Now, how are we going to handle it? Of course, the tone tenor of the Nepali Congress, if it wins, will probably have a salutary effect, but the Nepali Congress is in disarray. I mean, internally divided. It has always looked upon the Koiralas for leadership, and either there is no, there are too many Koiralas there right now, and not a single person who can really unite the party. So I don't know how good the Nepali Congress can, what kind of performance it will have if the election goes. And then on the other hand, we have the communists. Again, they're split, even with their 2/3 majority. The party just split. The whole thing collapsed. Now they probably won't be able to contest together, or even get a nice kind of a nice kind of presence in parliament. And then at the third level, there's this growing sense on the streets, basically, from people outside the system who once supported the Republic and secular federal constitution, who are now saying that this system just cannot work because it's not suitable. It just hasn't been able to work. So there may be a time for a wholesale rethink of the whole political process. And whenever a whole rethink of the political process comes around, then you have the question of the monarchy, and then the Maoists going back to the same 2005. So, these whole can of worms, I don't know how, even if there are elections, they won't be able to resolve these very, very different demands and dynamics.
Actually, Sanjayji, currently the ongoing confrontation which happened between India and China last year, and it has not been fully sorted yet. The forces are still there on the LAC on both sides. India actually gave a very aggressive reply to China, which earlier it did not used to.
Yes.
With Biden coming in the White House, of course, it will not be as hostile as Trump administration was towards China. So it looks like that India will be heading the anti-China alliance. Where does Nepal fit in now?
Nepal, has the untold story here also is, Nepal is in a very difficult position, which I explained in the last chapter of the book.
Yeah, actually.
We we do not take sides, not because out of any ulterior motive or out of any uh, desire to play one neighbor against the other. It's just because that we have, benefits, of course, from both sides, and which is something that is not widely debated, is we have grievances with China as well. This whole idea of
But
Nepal
that does
being,
not come to forefront as much as the differences with
yes,
India often emerge.
you see, that's the thing. And one thing that India has wisely, let's say, or very, very shrewdly done now, and you can see it in the editorials. I was seeing it in the Hindustan Times editorial yesterday, the Times of India the other day, that India says, okay, you know what, let's just sit back and let the Chinese, expose themselves for their
Fish in the
interference.
troubled waters and they will be exposed.
Yeah. So basically what happens is, I will give you an example. This whole concept of our border, the way it came up was, the Indian version initially seemed to be that, China kind of egged on Nepal, and that's why this whole thing came up. Whereas what really happened was that Lipu Lake, people, Nepalis didn't even know about that, claim of the territory up to that and whatever. But when Modi and President Xi signed that Lipu Lake trade, confidence building measure type of trade route opening treaty, the Chinese actually acceded to India's depiction of that territory in India's map, and they never asked us or never consulted us. So we felt that when it comes to them, when it comes to China's own interest, they're willing to forsake Nepal's territorial ambition, but then they make big noises about Nepalese sovereignty, independence, this, that, and we have this whole grievance about how much China actually means what it says. I mean, historically speaking, China has not been very reliable across the regimes. It never helped Nepal. It was treaty bound to help Nepal during the war with British India. And the British actually were very fearful of a Chinese response. I mean, Chinese support of Nepal in the 1814, 1816 war, but it never happened.
And the Treaty of Sagoli happened instead.
Instead, the Treaty of Sagoli happened, we lost 1/3 of our territory, and then the Chinese kept quiet. So the same way, when 1990, the Chinese sold us. Well, we bought arms from China that was at a lower rate, of course, but against Indian objections. But the price was too good for us, and then we left it. And then that whole thing triggered an entire Indian blockade, an entire regime change. And I still remember the Chinese prime minister was in Nepal during the height of the embargo, and we were at a press conference and somebody asked him a question about, look, it's your, arms that has created all this. Don't you have any role? We're under this whole Indian strangulation. And, he says, oh, you deal with India for that. So see, even that time,
shifting the blame very conveniently.
Yeah. And even the Maoists, okay, no matter what you say, okay, I mean, Prachanda, for whatever reason, okay, he may have overplayed his hand, by sacking that thing, the army chief, and then India stepped in to save the army chief because of that very strong military ties between the two countries, Nepal and India. But, he presented himself as this second coming of Mao, and he was thrown out and nothing. I mean, the Chinese don't view him So this whole thing, this whole narrative of India basing Nepalese actions as doing something at China's bidding kind of hits very hard in Nepal. This map issue has been going on since the 1962. I mean, the Kalapani issue since the 1962 war. I mean, was there some private agreement between the king and King Mahendra and Nehru, where in Nepal allowed India to station troops temporarily there
Yes.
for Nepal's own security? I mean, no matter how
Right.
relations we have with China, I mean, no country is stupid enough to put all its things in one basket. I mean,
Allow the People Liberation Army to have a field day in Nepal.
yeah, so we don't know all the things of that time. I mean, it's not like everything is on the Nepalese historical record and people have died. I've spoken to a few people. I've taken my notes, but most of the people are dead, and then there's not much I can say about that without compromising myself. But things are not that easy. And then so to say that we're doing China's bidding or we're doing somebody's bidding, like this whole this American thing coming on. We have this MCC Million Challenge Corporation now that comes as something between the BRI and the MCC, and we're a developing country. I mean, we need help from anywhere, but why do we have to be pushed into a position where we have to choose? I mean, India and China, like I said at the very end of my book, you have to settle something, because you cannot just both of China doesn't understand India's lack of understanding of Nepal's position, and vice versa. And so India and China blame each other, blame Nepal for stoking India-China tensions, whereas we are the primary victim, because India closes the border. It becomes news, blockade, because it's an open border. China closes the border. Nobody knows about it. They'll just say,
Actually.
the reconstruction hasn't been completed, and then the border is closed forever. I mean, so basically we are the victims here. I mean, blaming India, China blaming us for doing India's bidding, or India blaming us for doing China's bidding. I mean, that's the whole.
Nepal, that's the first.
That's the contradiction of Nepali independence. I mean, how independent can one be if our own concerns are subsumed into these wider things that we have no control over? I mean, China's not going to listen to us. I mean, no matter
That
what.
is what buffer states often complain about, that we are between two ambitious giants.
Yeah, I mean, it's finished. So you two countries have to come to some kind of agreement saying that, okay, this is this. Now we won't let any third parties come in. China won't let the Pakistanis come in. India won't let the Americans come in. I mean, but whatever you do in a way that Nepal preserves its independence or something. I mean, short of India annexing Nepal, which nobody probably thinks is done that anytime soon. So China annexing Nepal again. Happening soon, but this thing is going to go on, because the messy the political system in Nepal, and then this traditional suspicion, which India has been the victim of. But let me tell you, the Chinese are also are not faring too well. ATM hackers and all these smugglers and all women traffickers,
dumping their finished goods.
Yeah, so China too is facing the same situation there. And Nepal's
the little things with India are blown out of proportion, and even major things with China are deliberately underplayed.
Familiarity breeds contempt. I mean, the more you know somebody, the more you see the words and the moles and everything. But now the Chinese are finding that out now.
Right.
So these
Satyaji,
things.
Sir, please continue.
No. I mean, we have to let this thing. At some point, India and China have to sort out these things and see, how much. And I think they have done a good job when they have been able to do it independently. India,
Absolutely.
China, when they have good terms. I mean, we're good. Like I say, it's like, the elephant in the grass. I mean, when two elephants are there fighting, and then the grass has to be careful. And when the elephant are, playing, we have to be careful, So it's like
Actually,
for Nepal being the grass there.
Sanjay ji, as your book rightly claims that India has lost the plot to China. So the entire text of this book and our discussion tells me and tells our viewers that this losing of plot is not an irreversible process.
No, it's
This
not.
thing can be reacquired.
Mhm.
The plot can be reacquired. It can be
Yes.
consolidated, and
Yes.
India can start afresh.
It can, because let me tell you, I believe, that anything good coming out of this is, it's hardly difficult to say anything good in this, but it's been a tremendous learning experience for everybody, all three of us, or in even the extended wider world. Like, what do we do now? We cannot continue on blaming, everybody all the time now. We've done that for what, 70, 80 years now, and nothing's going to happen. No matter what government comes in Nepal, it's going to be the same. Bashing India will always be the vote getter, and then India will always have its security interests because of the softness of the open border, all these easy access to, just because Nepal has good ties with some other third country doesn't mean India has to have that same level of relationship with them, right? I mean, this is how you negotiate diplomacy.
Dehyphenation is what we call it, right?
Yeah. So, and India cannot apologize for its bigness. Nepal cannot apologize for its smallness. The same thing with China. Okay, you say we have been very, very no strings attached, but everything becomes dependent on Tibet. You didn't do this for Tibet, you didn't do this for Tibet. What are we supposed to do for Tibet? We
Actually,
never claim Tibet is not part of China. We've never said Taiwan is not part of China. And what else can we do? We haven't sent
absolutely.
we haven't armed Tibetans and sent them to anything. Although, let me say this: democratic leaders were the ones that used all the force against the Tibetan rioters during the
True,
pre-Olympic
true.
thing. So that also was some kind of investment from Nepal. Who goes around the world trying to blacken their faces, calling for a democracy,
Actually,
and beating up the Tibetans over there. So all these things, they count, and we cannot be held hostage to these preconceived notions of, either, you're under our protection or under that protection or this. And I think that process, that step we've crossed. I mean, basically, no matter whatever happened, whether you like Oli, you like Prachanda, you like Gyanendra, you like anybody, the knot has been
loosened actually.
loosened and untied. Now you have to do
Hmm.
something about it. We cannot do this alone. We cannot
Yes,
both be blamed for it and held account, be victimized for it. Both. Anything happens, there's a blockade on us. Anything happens, we're doing China's bidding. Anything happens, we're doing, all parties are run from India. The Chinese newspapers editorialize us, calls the Nepali Congress, an adjunct of the Indian National Congress. I mean, that's not how these things work in this modern day age. You have different systems. We're trying to survive in the middle of, two ancient civilizations that have had historically civilizational ties with us. And we have both of them here, but, we cannot be expected to be, now, we played,
oblivion to it. Yes,
yeah,
cannot be oblivion to it. The
against,
various
we played one side against the other in the past, and we've paid for it. And I think that's been the learning
actually.
experience for us. No, nobody can rely on anybody in any way that way, because unless you're strong from within, you have some set of convictions about your nation and nationhood, friends, and
Suddenly, this brings me back to the cardinal principle of international relations that there are no permanent friends or enemies. Nations have only permanent interest.
permanent interest. But again, Nepal, India, again, I mean, this is where I differ from a lot of my Nepali friends and people, where I get a lot of criticism. Some friends are more friends than others. So, it also depends on how much you have to rely on some friends, the friendship of some friends, than others. Not all friends are equal.
Actually.
Depending on your proximity, depending on your needs, depending on what part of the country. Like I was telling you, I used to visit India every day to read my newspaper. When I traveled to my father's birthplace in the Nepali Tarai, I would have to go through a road, a village, the dusty road, where I would never know whether I was in India or Nepal because it was zigzaggy and there were no border pillars, no nothing. And then
Difficult terrain over there.
I mean, it's all like, so that's thing now, unless we're prepared to close the border. I hear people say in my country that, oh, we have to close the open border. That way this is going to happen and that's going to happen. But let me tell you, the open border is why the Nepali currency is stable, because no matter what
Actually.
we're pegged to the IC, and the IC being stable against the US dollar. Our currency is stable against the US dollar also. Okay, are you willing to forego the economic benefits of the open border just to preserve the
Would be
political?
too much for the Nepali rupee to compete with the international currencies
That's what
if
I'm
it's
saying.
not an open border.
All
There
these
will be
things.
economic ramifications for that.
Yes, we have to be very, very honest about these things. So when you say,
Actually.
we're going to do this, we're going to do that, and diplomacy in the traditional sense, diplomacy. That's why when I talk about my childhood, this thing always kind of wondered me, like, which country in the world, we're so small, and then we have the India and China, opposing civilizations, opposing political systems, and I grew up during the Cold War, the height of it, and then we have the Soviets, and then the Americans.
Americans.
And the democracies, India and America do not see eye to eye. And then communists, China and Russia don't see to eye in eye. And then China and America are working together in Nepal. And Russia and India are working together in Nepal. So these things, when I was growing up, in the student movement and everything, it was a closed system. It was the king's direct rule. But still, it always used to pick me. So I used to talk to these people, I used to have easy access because, family and
Perhaps
society.
this is how you started to vent it out through your books.
Yeah, that's how I started. And then this thing it's amazing. You talk of Nepal and, is it a historical aberration? In some ways, yes. Is it going to pose a very significant but underappreciated challenge to the international the theory and practice of international relations? Yes. It's not going to be like Mongolia between China and Russia, and it's not going to, because India and China are not the same. And then we have America here. The first country that had diplomatic relations with us was America, who guaranteed our independence. And then the British, of course, they never took us directly, but basically they never left us alone either. So we were never formally part of the British Empire. I always say formally, but then they took away our 1/3 of our country, and then they left India and never gave us back that 1/3 again. So you give to India what India you took from India. You gave to India what you took from Nepal. So all these historical baggages, they have to be sorted out. But then if you sort out, it's today Almora, it's today Darjeeling. Now, if you ask the people there in Darjeeling or Almora, do you want to be in Nepal or in India? You think anybody will say they want to come to Nepal?
There are skeletons in everybody's cupboard.
See, so it's a very, very a nasty situation. Now, if you handle it with care, okay. And in the beginning, the good thing about the beginning was that Nepali leaders and Indian leaders, they were honed in the independence struggle, and they had even very personal, good relationships, even in exile. BP Koirala, I mean, he was, even after being overthrown, he was held in high esteem. In India, he could pick up the phone. The same with Krishna Prasad Bhattrai, Manmohan Adhikari, the communist. And that kind of thing has gone away, this easy political level approach, and it's more become bureaucratic. But again, we have this strength that a lot of your top diplomats, I'd like to say, people who have retired as foreign secretary or gone on to be ministers, they have started their junior diplomatic assignments in Nepal. They've come back for their mid-level career in Nepal, and they have so there's this great fund of understanding, goodwill, and a lot of things we have people who know Nepal, I mean, they in India, and the same way, if more people, if there are ways of bettering our understanding, because there's no alternative to this. We cannot go to minimalistic positions and say this. We listen to your legitimate grievances, we listen to ours. And my book, the earlier one, The Raj Lives, and then the second one, it's all coming out of this feeling, that I have for this, the need to preserve this unique relationship, this special relationship. I mean, it's just that I've never felt, even abroad, I mean, it's always, when I'm a Nepali, it's just, I've struck up friendships so easily, and we're just so alike in so many ways, and then just wonder why the problem with countries. Try to identify the situation. I mean, that's, I think, the only thing ahead. And this period we should take the positive side of these difficulties and just try to see what we can do to preserve this and build upon this unique relationship.
Sanjay ji, your book is a very compressive page turner, a very engrossing read, and everyone who reads this book will find this unique relation which you have tried to define in your own way. It tells us how it has happened, when it has happened, and how all these stakeholders who have tried to play their own rules over the bilateral relations. There are international players, there are players, domestic players from both the sides. So on this note, I would like to thank you, Mr. Sanjay, for all this insightful analysis of the bilateral relations in a way only which you could have. Thanks a lot for being with us, Mr. Sanjay. I would like to end here.
It's been great talking to you. I mean, and it's just, thank you so much for having me.
Most welcome, and wishing you all the very best with this book. And on this note, namaste finally to you. I would like to sign off. Take good care, sir.